party who promotes this kind of policy need fear being out of office long. Here it is worth mentioning that the average cost of state-mandated education in England between the ages of 5 and 16 is approximately €80,000 per head. Nevertheless, about a quarter of English school children are said to leave school unable to read sufficiently fluently to participate in that most important of all modern activities, reading and filling in forms claiming government benefits. How much money it would take for the state to run the education system in such a way as to teach them to read is an interesting hypothetical question. I suspect that there is not enough money in the world. Our current state system might very well have left Shakespeare illiterate and Newton unable to add 2 and 2. Well, let me briefly return to the unfortunate Welsh town in which, were it not for subventions from the state, the unemployment rate would approach 100%. Let us imagine that an unemployed person there gets to hear of an opportunity somewhere else in the country. Let us also suppose, what is increasingly unlikely thanks to the high social and other charges on labour, that his labour will be more valuable to a prospective employer than the cost of employing him. Can he move in the hope of finding that employment? No, he cannot. He almost certainly will have been accorded a privilege by the state in the form of subsidised housing. This privilege, however, is dependent upon him staying put. It is not immediately transferable to anywhere else, unless by some chance he finds someone at his destination who wants to move where he currently lives. Needless to say, several lifetimes could pass before this happens, and so the man is as trapped by his subsidy as any Russian serf was to his landowner, by his landowner before the emancipation of the serfs. Millions in Britain are in effect serfs of their local councils, to whom they owe no duty but continuing residence in the council's domain and turning out occasionally to vote for the council, which they will do largely because they fear to lose the very subsidy that entraps them. Another analogy would perhaps be the relationship of a drug addict to his drug dealer. He cannot, or at any rate will not, imagine life without him. The psychological and social consequences of living without either hope of economic improvement or without fear of economic deterioration, at any rate of any brought about by other than political means, such that the public subvention is either increased or decreased, are very wretched indeed, for all sense of personal agency is lost. In my view, this loss is the cause of a great deal of social pathology, for many people would prefer a life of self-induced crisis to a life of calm but entirely dull and bare sufficiency. There is thus an oscillation between complete apathy and insensate rage, an oscillation that can be seen on the streets of many British towns. Now, I want to make it perfectly clear here that I am not laying the blame fundamentally so much on the ultimate victims of the system that was once no doubt erected with the best of intentions, as on those who persistently fail to reform it or even to recognise that it needs reform. This is inexcusable, for in my opinion the system predictably had the potential for the direst of social and psychological consequences. But be this as it may, it has now become a well-nigh insatiable monster, at least in my own country. I've only begun to sketch some of the perversities of the system that we have instituted. Let us return to the situation where work is available in one part of the country and labour in another, but potential labour that is inserfed to local councils and cannot actually take the work up. What happens? Foreign labour is quickly sucked in to fill the gap. Now again, I must make it clear that I am not a vulgar xenophobe. It is difficult for me to be so because my mother was herself a refugee in England, to England in the 1930s. But the curious thing about the modern situation in England is that mass importation of foreign labour has continued pari passu with the existence of publicly subsidised mass unemployment. In England, the ranks of the unemployed have been transferred to the ranks of the supposed chronic sick to foster the illusion that unemployment has gone away and that our economy is growing so healthily that it needs foreign labour desperately to sustain it. In actual fact, the welfare state in Britain has achieved the miracle of creating more invalids than the First World War, precisely at a time when the health of a population is by far the best it has ever been, and second, when work requires less physical strength to complete it than at any time in human history. Now here it's only fair to point to cultural as well as to economic factors that have led to mass importation of labour at a time of mass native unemployment. No sensible employer would employ a young English person at the lower end of the educational spectrum if he could, for the same money, employ, say, a young Pole. The latter is likely to be more punctual, more eager to work, better able to do arithmetic, have better manners, and thus be able to deal with colleagues and members of the public than a young Englishman. Even more humiliatingly, he is even likely to speak better English than the Englishman. At least in the sense of having a better grammatical understanding of the language and a reluctance, or perhaps an inability, to use vulgar expressions. The young Pole is eager to save money because a surplus from even quite low wages will fund the construction of a house or the start of a business back home, which it will never do for the young Englishman for two reasons. First, his propensity to spend all he has the moment he has it, or in fact more than he has, the English being among the most personally indebted people in the world, often owing large sums for material trifles of no lasting value. Economic prudence having been rendered an irrelevant consideration by all the social protections he believes himself to be endowed with, both in practice and as a matter of inalienable right. So that his earnings are to him what pocket money is to the child. And second, because asset inflation, deliberately provoked and promoted by the government, has made the purchase of a house and even the renting of a house too expensive for him. Likewise, the cost of entry into business, the latter being mainly because of excessive regulation that de facto factors very large established businesses at the expense of small, unestablished ones. So while the Pole is ready and eager to make some sacrifices now for the sake of his future, the young Englishman is not, precisely because he sees the nature of his future as being completely disconnected from his own conduct. He lives in a terrible kind of limbo. Well, there are many other things I could say about the perversities of the system that we have erected and which has created two very large classes of dependents. Those at the lowest level who are the recipients of direct subventions, and those at the middle class level, rather like myself in fact, who work in the system and are well paid, even very well and increasingly grotesquely well paid. We are now beginning to see the political and economic consequences of the unravelling of the system, which for many years has been at base no more than a pyramid scheme, the Ponzi scheme, that dwarfs the pyramid scheme of Mr. Madoff, and differs from his mainly by its power to coerce rather than merely to solicit contributions. In Britain, we are beginning to see the social unrest that is always caused when subsidies are withdrawn because they have to be withdrawn, unless, that is, there is to be total, rapid and disastrous debasement of the currency that will cause unrest in another way. Those who receive subsidies may well be prepared to defend them with violence because they think they have no other means of livelihood. In other words, a system that was intended to be expressive of social solidarity becomes completely destructive of it and sets off one part of the population against another, in the meantime having destroyed the social and psychological well-being of those it was supposedly intended to protect. The owl of Minerva truly does spread its wings only at dusk. Well, once again, ladies and gentlemen, I thank Libera very much for the honour that they have done me. Thank you very much.